In the small town of Ramd near Tingen, Klein watched Fry leave, while he found a relatively clean stone to wipe it, and sat down. He sat bored for a few minutes, and after several hesitations, he still couldn't help but took down sealed artifact 30,782, rubbing his fingers on its surface. Perhaps I can foretell its origin. Klein thought for a while, took out the absorbent pen and paper from his chest, and carefully wrote down the divination statement. The origin of this sacred sun emblem. Klein skillfully closed his eyes and used meditation to pull himself into a dream. He felt that he was floating in a radiance, and there was endless fog in front of him. After a long time, there was no change. Yes, there must have been other diviners in the church who had divined this holy emblem before, and it is estimated that they were like me and found nothing. Klein thought for a while, and then wanted to exit the dream, but just when his spirituality first touched his body, the radiance and mist that seemed to last forever suddenly boiled. What's the situation? Klein was startled by the sudden change, subconsciously aroused his spirituality, and prepared to forcibly escape from the dream. The boiling fog seemed to have been inspired by an unknown person. The concentration gradually increased, the color deepened, and tentacles formed by rays of light extended. The newly formed grey fog is actually swallowing the surrounding brilliance. Klein's spirit body returned to his body, but the tentacles cast by the light had already climbed onto his body and were gradually swimming inwards. It actually entered into reality with the help of a dream. Klein's thoughts seemed to be filled with lead, and he felt that he was gradually losing control of his spiritual body. No, I have to pray to the goddess. No, Fu Sheng. Xian Huang. He took a step backwards with difficulty, and then his body froze there, his limbs twisted strangely, like a puppet suspended by a thread that came out of nowhere. Klein felt like he was submerged in water, and it was difficult to concentrate his thoughts, so he could only stare blankly at the water surface in front of him. The water surface composed of grey and white mist mixed with shimmer seemed to ripple, and the twisted water waves gradually turned into a moving picture. In the painting is a man in black with a hood, wandering in the barren land like a lone wolf. A half-lion half-dragon monster in the distance seemed to be staring at him, lowered his body, and kept making a grunting sound in his throat. Suddenly, the monster froze for a moment. Like a big cat, it lowered its body again and then lifted it up sharply. The bones made a crackling sound. As if everything just now was just for stretching. The picture composed of water wave is suddenly distorted, and a whole new picture is reconstructed. The man had already taken off his hood and floated in the air, with the corners of his worn and torn clothes floating casually. He was covered by a huge shadow, and the space around him twisted strangely, squeezing out clusters of pale flames out of thin air, surrounding the existence in the center. It was a bird-shaped behemoth with bronze eyeballs covered in feathers woven from pale flames and mysterious patterns. The giant bird seemed to be aware of the peeping, and a huge light suddenly burst out from its bronze eyeballs. What? Klein felt pain for the first time in the water. He tried to regain some of his consciousness, but was stabbed by the powerful light and couldn't open his eyes. Grass, it hurts. Wait, I seem to be able to move. Klein, who was enduring the pain, opened his eyes tentatively. He saw a priest bathed in golden light standing opposite him. He asked in a calm tone, "Your state is not very good, is it the anchor's problem?" Anchor? Klein just wanted to ask what it was, but found that he had opened his mouth, and his voice was gentle and pure. No, it's just that he has become active again recently. Since sheltering the elves, my anchor has become sufficient, but you... That's not my voice. While terrified, Klein wanted to hear the words behind himself, but the priest in front of him, bathed in golden light, seemed to have spied on his thoughts and lowered his hand a little. The ravings he heard when he was promoted to the fortune teller appeared again. It was like a huge steel nail had been inserted into his brain, which was constantly stirring his brain. Klein couldn't help lowering his body, trying to put his head in his hands to relieve the pain, but found that his body had nearly collapsed into countless squirming maggots. He stared blankly ahead, no fear in his mind, but calmly thought about the current situation. Am I out of control? I wonder if Captain and the others can kill me before I completely turn into a monster. No, I might be able to rescue it, but Captain and Fry are both in the hotel. Klein raised his head with his neck made of maggots, and stared blankly at the gap in the woods, only to see several illusory huge pillars appearing out of thin air around him, and the man in the painting just now floating in front of him. For the first time, he saw the man's face clearly. It was a soft and delicate face full of elvish characteristics. His eyes were dark and dull, and it seemed that all his emotions had been wiped away, and he was looking down at him indifferently. Klein's head also gradually collapsed, and his whole body turned into a maggot mass composed of clasped worms, frantically slapping everything around him. Unknown gazes were cast from the stars, and the entire dense forest seemed to be wrapped in a thick dark flannel, completely blocking the connection with the outside world, and even the roar became silent. Depend on. Klein suddenly fell to the ground. He didn't care about the pain, he got up immediately, and kept slapping the dust on the windbreaker. I fell asleep just now. Klein turned around and looked suspiciously at the fairly flat stone. He only remembered that he had divination about the origin of the sun's sacred emblem, and then seemed to vaguely see an endless light and a thin mist. In the end, there seems to be a man's hand. Not necessarily, that hand is white and thin, maybe it's a lady. Klein looked around with a guilty conscience, and found that Captain and Fry were not here before sitting back on the stone. The time hasn't come yet, the captain probably won't come to me in advance. What was the situation just now? This is an item bestowed by a certain existence. So there is interference? What if interference was eliminated? As soon as this idea appeared, it quickly took over his brain. This is reasonable. After several hesitations, Klein still looked around. After confirming that no one was there, he picked up 30,782, passed through the layered roar again, and entered above the grey fog. In the majestic palace, Klein sat at the top of the ancient long table, showing the mutated holy emblem of the sun. He weighed the thin piece of gold in his hands, as skilled as he had done it many times before. As if he didn't notice anything, he took the pen and paper and wrote down the divination statement. After reading it 7 times, he leaned back in the chair and entered the dream. The grey fog cut off the sky, and a drop of golden, bright, warm illusory liquid floated on the altar. A man in a white robe beside the altar frantically held the holy symbol of the sun, and his vitality was drawn out bit by bit, turning it into a bridge linking the mysterious liquid and the holy symbol. Finally, he lost all the breath of life and fell down on the altar. The drop of bright golden liquid also slowly merged into the holy emblem. Reading www.yuyuganshu.com outlined an incomplete fuzzy symbol. A ritual of self-sacrifice. This question just popped into Klein's mind, and the picture of the dream quickly changed the picture as if to answer it. The shattered brilliance once again formed the drop of illusory liquid, but this time it became huge, hanging in the fragmented sky and the deep starry sky behind it blocked by the grey-white fog, like a sun wheel. Suddenly, power from out of nowhere filled that drop of liquid, and the false sun instantly filled up, becoming bright and hot. Accompanied by a humming sound coming from the boundless void, the pure flame instantly ignited everything, and the hot golden waves swept outward frantically. Boom! Klein was thrown out of the dream at once, and lost his normal perception, leaving only the endless burning pain on his body. The immeasurable flames caused a drastic change in the grey fog. The fog around Klein instantly wrapped the golden sun wheel, and the dream that had already collapsed reappeared. The golden sun was filled once again, and the flames that had spread before got rid of his control, and under the influence of time, it actively went back. The sun was firmly nailed into the false starry sky, and this time he actually showed the emotion of fear. He tried his best to expand, and the sun that broke through the limitations of its shape was now more like a human-shaped phantom made of brilliance. His body twisted uncontrollably, his hands were raised heavily, and he put on a blue-black cloak for himself with difficulty. Suddenly, his movements became relaxed. He pulled up his hood, seemed to be in a happy mood, bowed forward slightly, and then disappeared directly into the grey fog, leaving only Klein still burning in a dilapidated palace. What? Originally sitting at the head of the long bronze table, Klein, whose whole body was dyed with golden flames, suddenly regained consciousness, screamed and rolled to the side, his body trembling and twitching involuntarily. He hunched his waist, rolled back and forth, screaming, trying to put out the golden flames on his body. The originally solidified grey fog seemed to hear his screams. The grey fog rose like a tide and partially drowned Klein's body. He began to extinguish the golden flames on his body, and slowly repaired the terrifying burns. Parts quickly gathered, holding up the collapsed palace dome and giant pillars. Klein fell on the ground, his hands clasped on the ground, trying to regain the consciousness he had initially recovered. After a long time, he held on to the armrest of the high-backed chair and climbed up with difficulty, terrified and dazed by the experience just now. He didn't expect that just divination would cause such a consequence. Klein looked around subconsciously and found that although the towering palace and long bronze table that seemed to have remained unchanged from time to time had been repaired by the grey-white tide water, the charred burn marks and scattered holes were enough to show the huge size just now. The power of destruction. He slowly slid down, slumped on the high-backed chair, patted the burnt marks on his body, and thought in a trance. I didn't directly divination to the eternal blazing sun just now, did I? If it wasn't for this grey fog that restricted the activity of the huge sun in time and blocked the projection of his power at the last minute, I might have evaporated directly. That's the divine blood of eternal blazing sun? But how could it be made into a sealed artifact? If it is really the divine blood lost by eternal blazing sun, it can't be just a level 3 sealed artifact. The believers of sun are even more so. It is impossible to give this holy emblem, which is enough to be called a holy relic, to someone else. And I always feel like I've forgotten something. Is it the last piece of knowledge that was suddenly squeezed into my head that impacted my memory? Klein wondered about what happened just now, and the more he thought about it, the more afraid he became. Not only did I almost explain it just now. This grey fog is not right, it actually moved when I lost consciousness. Is this thing alive? Forget it, I can't use everything for divination in the future. If there is another similar operation or two, I don't think the ashes will be left. Klein's body was no longer scorched black. He stared at the grey fog in front of him, tapping his fingers on the top of the long bronze table, and staring at the place where the grey-white tide had just receded. That was the deeper part of the grey fog. No matter how Klein looked at it, it was as blurry as ever, making it impossible for people to see clearly. Forget it, the divine blood divination just now aroused unnecessary connections, so I can't do it anymore. Tisk, it's not all bad, at least it made me discover the weirdness of this grey fog space. Klein stopped his movements a little. I also figured out its potential, which can be compared with the power of God's confrontation, but at least until the angel level can really find the hidden secret, and only then can it truly become its master. As Klein thought, he conjured up a piece of paper and a pen. He wanted to write down the piece of knowledge that blew his mind just now. It was at the cost of his own life. He used dream divination to sort out the chaotic memories in his mind, and wrote them down one by one. 1. The Sunday. 2. Don't look directly at God. 3. Pure white angel. 4. Redemption rose. 5. The main material of ancient scholars is the heart of the demon wolf of fog. 6. The production skills of the sun flame talisman without the dark talisman. 7. Singer's potion formula. 8. The people who pray for the light. The main material of sequence 4 no dark one is. This is not right. Klein couldn't help but knocked on the edge of the long bronze table again. The ancient scholar didn't look like the formula of the sun sequence. Could this be the knowledge related to this grey fog? Then how much of the knowledge I got just now is about the sun and how much is about the grey fog? In fact, for him, he was lucky enough to avoid most of the damage just now, and gaining a lot of knowledge can be said to be profitable, but this mixed knowledge has to make people think more. This is the real potion formula, and there are even 2 incomplete formulas of high sequence. No matter which organization it is placed in, this is a real merit, and even if it is sold, it is a huge amount of property. You can't think blindly, you can't kill yourself, at least Little Sun's potion formula is available. But what is a pure white angel? Sequence 1 or sequence 2 of the solar sequence? The content of the main material of the dark one proves that the drop of golden liquid is the divine blood of the eternal blazing Sunday. 30,782 is definitely a level 1 sealed artifact that was wrongly rated because it was sufficiently secretive. And that rose of redemption. Thinking of this, Klein suddenly felt a sharp pain and emptiness in his brain, and he had stayed in the grey fog for too long. Coupled with the successive shocks just now, his mental state it's gotten to the extreme. While worrying about his body outside, Klein quickly wrapped himself in spirituality and plunged down. He was afraid that as soon as he went out, he would find that the sun's sacred emblem had been damaged, or caused some too obvious changes, and he would not be able to explain it at that time. Klein opened his eyes carefully. The crimson moonlight passed through the dense canopy, showing mottled traces on the ground. Weeds and shrubs not far away swayed gently, and Fry's blurry figure in the distance was among them. There seemed to be only his slight footsteps left in the silent woods. Klein looked down at the intact 30,782, and felt an unprecedented peace of mind. In the dark cave, huge, slender stalactite columns spread down from the top of the cave and plunged straight into the darker and deeper depths. A rough spiral staircase follows the irregular side walls of the cave, winding down and extending downwards. Not far away, there are half a milky white candle exuding a strange aroma and a simple and gorgeous full-length mirror. It was a very smooth silver mirror that was polished, but the strange thing was that the entire mirror surface did not reflect even a trace of light, as if the entire picture in the mirror was in a strange secret state. In the unchanging silence, a pale, slender hand broke the strange state of the silver mirror. It stretched out from the mirror, grasping the simple and exquisite frame, as if to forcefully drag the rest of the body out. The white candles on the spiral staircase ignited quickly, and clusters of black flames were like torches. The aftermath of the flames instantly shattered the surrounding silver mirrors, leaving only the side with the pale arm emerging. The mysterious elements of the entire cave seemed at this moment, it has been twisted and attached to the only remaining mirror, all of which are helping the owner of that hand out of trouble. The other equally pale arm also stretched out the mirror. Driven by the 2 arms, a weak, pure and beautiful girl squeezed out of the mirror. The purple snakehead tentacles attached to her back suddenly snapped, leaving only broken hair scattered all over the floor. Before the weak and pure girl could react, the broken hair on the ground quickly ignited an illusory black flame, directly destroying her own traces. The girl lifted the bangs on her forehead that were glued together due to sweat, and directly tore off the plain white dress that was disfigured on her body, revealing a fair and slender naked body. A gemstone silver necklace surrounded by several tiny diamonds. The girl was holding the huge blue-purple gemstone, the black and smooth hair on the back was divided into several strands, clinging to the graceful curve of the body, covering the privacy of the body little by little, and the tight restraint was stretched out on her body. There is a red mark that is enough to be called a crime. The tightly entwined long hair suddenly spread out, and a bodysuit made of spider silk had already covered the girl's body. With the girl's beautiful curves and the still exposed large and white patches, it was enough to evoke people's hearts. Pity and love, or extreme sadistic desires. Of course, there was no audience in the deep cave, and the girl didn't care about it. She still held the blue-purple gemstone on the necklace obsessively and asked softly, "Did you just burn the Black Maiden's hair? Where is this?" A thin white fog suddenly gathered around her. The fog was erratic and had no specific shape. It seemed to collapse at any time, and it seemed to be extremely close. "This is the ruins of the altar built for me by the Tamara family in the 4th epoch. If you were decisive just now, I could even leave that disaster witch behind instead of letting her detect the danger in time and burn her hair to escape. Obviously there is a sealed artifact of a planeswalker, but it can't win the duel in the space. I'm starting to regret giving you a blessing." The girl puffed up her cheeks in dissatisfaction, and she couldn't help raising her voice, and said a little angrily, "I was suppressed in terms of personality, and most of the abilities of Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com have failed. Besides, I have escaped, haven't I? Isn't this your altar? Even if someone comes again, as long as Yuan Chu doesn't come in person, I'll be sure to keep him." Speaking of which, she seemed to think of something happy, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. "Besides, you said that your personality is even higher than that of a god, right? Then can I have a good rest?" At this moment, the mist around the girl seemed to sense something, and tightened all of a sudden, forming a three-dimensional symbol with a mixture of scales and crown patterns, which gave a feeling of being both regular and distorted. The space around the girl was quickly cut and separated into special areas intermingled with the spiritual world. Together with the sudden appearance of 7 auras, all the girl's escape routes were blocked. At the junction of the spiral staircase, the remaining light and dust around him were intertwined into a man in a white gold robe. He looked pitifully at the lovable and lovable girl who exposed a large area of fair skin below. The space behind him was suddenly dyed with a strong color, revealing a sky covered with grey fog and crimson stars dotted in it. The girl in the spider silk blouse had a nervous expression, subconsciously arousing the blue-purple gemstone in her hand, and the surrounding environment suddenly distorted and stopped abruptly, returning to normal. The roaming that should have been successful failed. The mist around the girl changed shape again, condensing into a grey palace skirt, completely wrapping the beautiful curve. Her eyes were dyed with a hint of gold, and her tense expression suddenly relaxed, revealing a strange smile. Mysterious believers. A secret believer. The girl wrapped in a grey and complicated palace skirt had a strange smile on her face, raised the skirt corners with both hands, raised her hands and lowered her hands, and performed a nondescript court ceremony. The man in the white gold-trimmed robe did not change his expression. He continued to strengthen the blockade of the spiritual world and space. He put his right hand on his chest and answered the question posed by the girl just now. "I am the tracer under my lord, Roman Ambrosius. The great mist of uncertainty, you are not slowly corrupting and waiting to die in the valley of Horn-Akis, why are you interested in being a thief?" The girl's expression did not change, she still had a standard smile. She looked up and down at Ambrosius, avoided the question, and joked, "Is it because Mystery lost too much energy when it sealed the City of Calamities and lost himself in it? Why do you bugs hiding in the gaps in time and space all have the face of a hunter?" As she spoke, she looked around at the irregular marks on the walls of the surrounding caves, which seemed to be slashed by knives and axes, and changed the subject abruptly, with a hint of mockery in her tone, "Speaking of which, after all, you are mortals who steal the authority of the gods, and you just imitate the behavior of the gods in a foolish way, imagining that you will truly gain authority through this, and put on a gorgeous coat to accept the worship of even humbler mortals." Ambrosius stared blankly at the neurotic one-man show of the girl opposite, gradually tightening the space around her and accelerating the cutting of them. The girl at the moment is like a specimen embedded in a diamond. But she was still calm, facing this huge cave, and said to herself, "The clown of Solomon, his understanding of order and distortion has only touched the worst side. In the vast starry sky, I have seen many thieves who want to touch the authority of order, but only he is so despicable." At this moment, the voice of the girl suddenly rose, and the pattern of the grey and complicated palace skirt also followed suit. The distortion seems to be connected with the distortion traces of the surrounding cut space. This childlike asymmetrical aesthetic is just as ridiculous as your poor spatial arrangement. Although the mysterious guy is shameless, he is still unmatched on the road of a liar. You have too much bottom line. Ambrosius frowned. He just wanted to adjust the arrangement of the surrounding space and make another segmentation, but he was surprised to find that he was locked in his own trap. Immediately, his eyes shattered and bled as he looked directly at the witch demigod who had been completely manipulated by the uncertain mist. The essence of this altar is the storage for the Tamara family to summon and solidify the power of the uncertain mist. The performance of uncertain mist in front of Ambrosius just now was not a groaning insanity. Part of him would not have had mental problems because of this. Everything he did just now was to delay time and take the opportunity to transfer the power within the bodies of those Tamara family members that he had deposited on the ground. And the existence in front of me that uses the witch demigod as a container is not a mist of uncertainty in the true sense. She is more like a mental suture that accepts part of the fog of uncertainty and part of consciousness. While trying to simulate fraud and throwing himself out of the ruins, Ambrosius closed his eyes and asked carefully, "You manipulated her to accommodate that planeswalker trait?" The mist of uncertainty raised his eyebrows indifferently, and while tightening the manipulation of space, he played with his hair like a little girl, wrapping it around his fingertips bit by bit, spread out a little. "Actually, my goal at the beginning was you, and I had no choice but to choose her as the container. Oh, this body is a naive and stupid fool. The only thing she can praise is to be fooled. Unfortunately, you have the aura of Sephiroth Castle on you. Although I am very interested in the authority of mystery, I don't want to be put into a lamp like another self. You are indeed very smart. You have deliberately avoided communicating with me from the very beginning, but at the beginning, because of bribery, I distorted my mind and answered my question. To be honest, I don't think my distortion is more worth guarding against than your fraud. Also, you really have a bottom line, and your moral standard is quite high. Obviously, as long as I kill all the remnants of Tamara, I can eliminate the hidden danger of my quick accumulation of strength. You should really learn from your master on this point. It is always the stupidest choice to leave risks to yourself. You are far worse than another mysterious angel sage in this regard. I have been in contact with him so many times. How could I not know how many angels he has? Your response is my best key to unlocking the shadow of order." The words of uncertain mist were deliberately compressed into crazy syllables. These superimposed sounds tore apart Ambrosius' thoughts, and the invisible words turned into tangible soldering irons, stinging his soul caused substantial expansion and contraction of his body, and endless fragmented light spots and worm heads made of starlight appeared, which seemed to collapse into a mass of scattered worms in the next moment. He couldn't help speeding up the fraud of the rules and space, completely abandoning the blockade of the surrounding, just hoped that he could stay away from the terrifying existence in front of him. In the next second, everything returned to calm. Ambrosius, who should have used fraud to escape the ruins, remained in place, while the mist of uncertainty opposite him disappeared. He seemed to have noticed something, distorted the target at the moment when the fraud took effect, and took the opportunity to chaos the layout of the space, giving up the idea of using space cutting to kill Ambrosius, and directly broke away from the original. It should be the remains of the altar of his own home. Ambrosius stared blankly at the silent and empty spiral staircase in front of him. He found that the pollution he had just caught by looking directly at the uncertain mist was gone. He hurriedly lowered his head, and silently recited the honorable name Mystery, a fool who does not belong to this era. A great ruler farther than far away. Rooted in the ancient of mystery. I beg your attention. The dazzling stars flickered again, quickly changing their arrangement in front of the whispered prayer to Ambrosius. He is trying to use his corresponding crimson star symbol on Sephiroth Castle to divination the whereabouts of the uncertain fog container. After a while, Ambrosius suddenly raised his head, his brows were tightly closed, and his expression was unprecedentedly heavy. He did fortune tell the information of that container. Xiao Lu Tamara Treville, this is her new name, and her next target seems to be Backlund, who is enriched by the Inquisitor pathway. But this is the feedback from Seaman Castle, and the Lord did not respond to his request. Although the Lord has hardly answered prayers since he fell asleep, this time, he can clearly feel that the Lord's honorable name is invalid. Under normal circumstances, even if a deity falls or is downgraded, the honorable name will still point to that god. Only when the gods themselves give up the honorable name and block prayers can the honorable name become invalid. Ambrosius frowned, and roamed himself into the depths of the spiritual world. Looking at the 7 rays of pure light in the high place, he couldn't help but wonder, Lord, are you awake? Klein stood beside the typewriter, carefully watching Fry write yesterday's mission report and the reimbursement application for the corresponding consumption. It was not until he saw that all the materials he had used had been included in the list, he nodded with satisfaction, and stood on tiptoe. The foot quietly left the typewriter, like a big cat eating cheese. Because he spent too much energy and spirituality in the divination last night, he quickly fell asleep as soon as he returned to the Nighthawk's lounge, and only now did he have the energy to determine whether he could reimburse the materials. After saying goodbye to Dunn and Roshan, Klein left the Blackthorn Security Company. He had made an appointment with Dr. Duster from the lunatic asylum to meet at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Speaking of the knowledge I gained last night, I can report it carefully in the future. This should increase my contribution and help me to be promoted to the clown faster. I can't forget the fact that the grey fog seems to have life. Tisk, my sequence is still too low, even if it really hurts me one day, I don't have any countermeasures. Klein has already walked to the shooting club at 33 Zoetland Street UU reading www.uugonshu.com. He didn't go directly to the shooting range dedicated to the night watchman. Instead, he found a place in the hall to sit down, took a newspaper from the small table next to him, read it leisurely, and pretended to wait for someone. In fact, he is really waiting for someone. He wrote to Dr. Duster before to meet here. After nearly 10 minutes, Klein heard heavy footsteps approaching him. He put away the newspaper and saw that Dr. Duster, who was quite gentle, was already standing in front of the club's front desk. Klein looked at Dust, who was paying by the front desk, wearing a black silk top hat, a fitted tuxedo, and gold-rimmed eyes. He put the newspaper back, also went to the front desk to pay the fee, and followed Duster into the small shooting range number 7. After confirming that there was no one behind him, Klein softly locked the door, turned to look at Dr. Duster. The corners of his mouth were slightly upturned, and he joked, "You seem to have a lot of experience in underground joints, Mr. Duster." As if being stabbed by something, Duster turned his head sharply and looked around, until he used the ability of the spectator to confirm that there was no one hiding around, and then said a little reproachfully, "Officer Moretti, deliberately scaring people is not a gentleman's behavior. This is humor." Klein shrugged, carefully took out a 10 solar note from his wallet, and handed it to the other party. "I just think Lone's life lacks too much humor. This is your action cost. We will not let peripheral members bear the task cost." Seeing that Dust was stunned, he still accepted the 10 soli note. Klein immediately said sternly, "That mental patient, has Hoodugin behaved abnormally recently?" "That mental patient, has Hoodugin behaved abnormally recently?" Klein asked seriously. Dust did not immediately answer Klein's question. Instead, he carefully examined his eyes, expressions, and actions, with some hesitation in his words. "He has recently been similar to before, and is still using his abilities to try to treat patients. Although he has successfully cured some patients to a certain extent, he has also been suspected by other doctors and nurses because of this." Speaking of which, Dr. Duster paused and began to recall while saying, in order to get rid of doubts, he has recently started to claim that he is a descendant of some noble entis. To be honest, this crazy talk is very useful, at least no one has suspected him recently. Cough, he imitated some customs of Intis in his behavior. Dr. Duster said this, it is rare out of the spectator state. Intis's customs? Wouldn't it be Emperor Rosel's characteristic behavior? Klein couldn't help slandering in his mind. However, after treating many mentally ill patients, is it the sequence 7 corresponding to audience, psychiatrist? Then it seems that his acting method is not well mastered. Or maybe he figured out the acting method by himself, but it was relatively incomplete and only grasped a part of the essence? Tisk, it is most likely that he was unconsciously exercising his extraordinary abilities, and by the way, he completed the role. Although according to Dr. Duster's report, Hood Eugen's condition is very stable. But it's still not reassuring. Why did he call himself a noble of Intis? If it is just to divert the attention of other staff, then he has too many choices as a spiritual extraordinary. And if he wanted to, there was no way he would be noticed by the rest of the asylum. So he had a problem when he was acting unconsciously. Klein thought to himself, his brows could not help tightening. He suddenly thought of a fact that had been ignored before. Among the secret organizations he knew, only the Secret Order had mastered the act of acting, while other secret organizations with less seniority, including the Heart Alchemy Association, did not propose the content of the acting method. Is it because the Secret Order has existed for longer? If it is said that other secret organizations cannot master the acting method because of their short history, how could the Church of the Evernight Goddess not master the acting method? No matter which Orthodox church has been passed down for at least 1,000 years. But now he seems to have found the answer. According to Hood Eugen's situation, it seems that it is not correct, or that the biased playing will lead the Beyonder to the edge of losing control. For the high-risk groups who are most likely to suffer from mental problems Beyonders, any strange behavior that is different from usual may be a precursor to loss of control. Klein was distracted by the newly discovered problem. Looking at his gradually worsening face, Dust couldn't help but ask nervously, Officer Moretti, is there something wrong with Hood Eugen? Cough, no, I just thought of something else. Klein suppressed his doubts, and used a smile to cover up Dust's worries. However, after thinking about it carefully, he still warned, there is no problem with Hood Eugen at least now, but you have to step up your observation of him. Once his playing crazy behavior has intensified, you must report it immediately and ensure your own safety. We don't want to lose an excellent perimeter member. Dust opened his mouth and quickly returned to the calm expression he had just met with Klein. He just murmured in his heart, Officer, are you serious? My experience tells me that your expression is saying that there is definitely something wrong with Hood Eugen's playing crazy. Klein found that he seemed a little embarrassed, and quickly changed the subject. You can tell me about the recent activities of the Psychology Alchemy Club, or your own state. When Dust heard this, he immediately turned serious, and his face became a little heavier. The Psychological Alchemy Society has only carried out minimal daily activities recently. And myself, I have recently heard some incomprehensible babble. Well, to be precise, it can no longer be called babble, more like the roar of a large creature. The roar of the large creature. Klein was hooked all of a sudden. After all, according to the symbol behind Miss Justice's high-backed chair, the audience should correspond to a giant dragon. Then, the so-called roar of large creatures is not the dragon's roar. Klein pretended to smile easily, trying to fool Dust over. Don't worry, it's just a normal situation. As long as you don't pay attention, you won't have mental problems, and, as our valuable peripheral members, we won't let you run the risk of losing control. Officer, you are lying. You didn't look calm when you first heard my words. Dust's voice, which had been raised because of the questioning, suddenly dropped. Please tell me, what exactly is the roar I heard? As expected of the audience. Klein thought about it and replied, according to some folklore, the giant dragon is the leader in the spiritual realm. Klein tried his best to make a reasonable nonsense. If you're willing to make some contributions, I can share with you some free tips to avoid getting out of control." When Dust heard this, he sighed with relief. The so-called contribution is something substantive, which can reassure me more than those high-sounding rhetoric. "Officer, what do you want me to pay?" "This is all for Miss Justice's mind reader formula, and it is also for Nighthawks to better monitor wild beyonders." Klein suppressed his shame and said solemnly, "Let's talk about the method first. In daily life, as long as you keep your behavior close to the name of the sequence you are in and play it, you can avoid most of the dangers. For example, the acting technique of the audience is to try to keep itself out of the way, but it must not be overacted. I guess Hood Eugen has some problems because of this. As for contribution, don't worry about it, you can share something that is relatively easy to obtain, such as the activity report of the Psychology Alchemy Association, internal information, or the recipe of Mind Reader." Dust chewed these words and nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll try to get the Mind Reader formula." Klein looked at the thoughtful Dr. Dust before him and nodded with satisfaction. "Hey, I'm so busy, I'm really not suitable for dealing with young women. Elizabeth is too enthusiastic. My boss of a secret organization is busy like a social animal. Although my current main business is not fundamentally different from social animals. Judging from the previous information, the Church should indeed be deliberately suppressing the extraordinary of the divine expert pathway. No, it should be that all the churches of the righteous God are suppressing the extraordinary of the unofficial pathway. This will indeed help reduce the number of extraordinary, the frequency of events." Klein leaned back on the chair in the bedroom, relaxed his limbs, and pondered similar questions. It was not until the pointer on the watch reached 2:50 that he took 4 steps in the opposite direction and came to the top of the grey fog. Klein sat at the top of the long bronze table. After taking a careful look around, he breathed a sigh of relief and began to divination about the things he had always cared about. Grey mist didn't suddenly come alive, and he really couldn't scare himself. Klein thought as he untied the citron pendulum wrapped around his left wrist and let it hover above the divination statement. "I can successfully be promoted to Joker through the proper channels of the Nighthawks." The spiritual pendulum in Klein's hand slowly began to shake, and after a pause, it turned clockwise. "Sure, but not completely sure, or not so sure." Klein didn't believe in evil, so he divination again, but the result was the same. He was trying to tell me that there was a certain risk. Couldn't there be a better way? This idea suddenly appeared in Klein's mind, and he couldn't help but sort out the recent events again. "Hey, you can't stud. After all, as long as you seek promotion, you can't be without risk, and risk means the possibility of failure." Klein quickly put his worries aside, he couldn't let himself think too much. In short, the divination still points to regular promotion in the Nighthawks. He stretched out his hand to the crimson star symbolizing the sun, summoned the other party in advance, and after confirming that he had not been exposed to the 6-member council, he taught the other party his honorable name, and then summoned Justice and the hanged man on the grey fog. The fool sat at the head of the long table, his voice as steady as usual, and introduced to the 2 old members, "This is a new member, Sunday." A man with a scruffy beard and a worn brown worker's uniform was dragging himself with a half-empty wine bottle in his hand, wandering aimlessly along the banks of the Tussock River. He was looking for a less slippery place to relieve the pressure in his lower abdomen. As a worker who lived to be 40, he knew all too well how many hapless people slipped into the Tussock River each year and became part of that stinky slush. Fortunately, he could have a good grasp of how drunk he was, just like now. He could stand firmly on the shore, unbuttoned his pants, and relieved the burden of suffocating people. He looked at the filthy surface of the Tussock River, and found that bubbles were emerging from the water surface, as if there was a large fish hidden under it. The drunk worker half squinted his eyes, feeling very relieved, thinking radiantly, "I don't know if there will be any fish in this damned river. Last time that kid Downey fell into it, swallowed a lot of water and didn't die. Tisk, if there are fish, take it out and wash it well, it's not that you can't eat it. Cozy just gave birth to that little unlucky egg." Fish is good for children, right? Who said Backlund workers don't have grandchildren? Thinking of this, the drunk and sloppy worker from UU reading www.uugonshu.com smiled happily and was about to put on his pants and leave. At this time, the originally filthy river surface suddenly burst open, and a figure with phantom scales on both hands and water plants wrapped around his body jumped out of the river surface. The figure was like a shark that smelled blood. With a quick and flexible swing, the worker who was frightened on the shore threw himself into the water. Plop! The shark plunged into the water, and huge water waves remained on the river surface, and bubbles emerged one after another. After a while, the river surface was dyed with a layer of dark red. The surface of the river swayed again, and the worker who had just been thrown into the river climbed up from the river. His eyes were no longer blurred, and he walked firmly towards the direction of the factory area. In the river behind him, there was a mutilated corpse half floating in the water with the same face as him. Audrey recalled the information about the Aurora Society just given by the hanged man, and said in a painful way, "Mr. Hanged Man, you don't need to pay that reward anymore." Alger shook his head indifferently, and said in a deep voice, "Actually, I would rather use the answer just now and the extra payment to entrust you to investigate something." "What are you busy with?" Audrey asked suspiciously. "I received information that Lieutenant Admiral Hurricane Kylingus may have infiltrated Backlund. He is a Sequence 6 wind-blessed and has a sealed artifact that uses the ability of other pathways." Alger's expression suddenly became very solemn. "Once he enters the East District, the investigation activities will be impossible to start." Lieutenant Admiral Hurricane Kylingus, one of those 7 pirate generals. Not only Audrey, but even Klein, who was sitting at the head of the long bronze table, almost did not keep his expression. And the rest of the people, more or less, have heard similar names. According to the internal intelligence of the Nighthawks, every pirate general is an extremely dangerous existence. But now, the hanged man says that he has infiltrated Backlund. How did he sneak in? It is impossible for the whereabouts of such a dangerous person not to be noticed by the authorities. Klein thought to himself. If it's true, I can't even report this information to the captain. As a night watchman in an inland city, how can I accurately grasp the information of the pirate general? Forget it, let it be, I don't have to worry about everything. Klein decided to give up his own thoughts on this matter, and instead wanted to see the justice response. Audrey has recovered from the slight gaffe just now, and has returned to the audience state. Although she is curious about what the sealed artifact is, she doesn't want to reveal her attitude quickly. After becoming an extraordinary and participating in various gatherings and activities as an audience, she already knew how stupid her naive behavior in front of the hanged man was. Seeing that Justice didn't answer, the whole party was a little cold for a while, and immediately turned his head to look at Klein and said, "Mr. Fool, can I ask your favored person to provide the necessary help? I will pay you a remuneration equivalent to this." "Blessed person, how can I have any favored person?" Klein used the spit to ease his own embarrassment, while slightly shaking his head and smiling perfunctorily said, "My blessed one is hunting down another more dangerous target recently. I will spread this quest. If any blessed one happens to be in Backlund, your wish may come true. Follow your will." Seeing that there was no progress, Alger could only withdraw his gaze, half disappointed and half expected. Audrey looked at the hanged man who had been praying to Mr. Fool to no avail, and asked eagerly, "What's so special about Kylingus' sealed artifact that can use other pathway abilities?" Just now, she carefully weighed the pros and cons and her own resources and abilities, and found that she has a good investigation ability in Backlund. First of all, she can use her father's power and her own reputation to use a lot of resources in the upper circle. Secondly, the 2 Beyonder friends she met recently also have their own circles. As a former doctor and now a well-known writer, Furs knows a lot of people in the middle class, and Hudilcha, an arbiter, is a well-known mediator in the eastern part of Backlund. Both the working class and the gang are able to speak out, and they can get some easily overlooked information from secret channels. In this way, she alone can touch the news source of almost all classes of people in Backlund. Coupled with the other Beyonders that Hugh and Furs knew and the party they had joined, she might not be able to give it a try, and took over the request of the hanged man to investigate Kailingus. The hanged man saw that Justice suddenly became positive, the corners of his mouth could not help slightly tilt, and he answered her question without any hesitation, "It is an evil sealed artifact. Because it combines the abilities of multiple sequences, it is impossible to determine which path it belongs to, but those who are familiar with Kailingos know that he is called wriggling hunger. A glove-shaped sealed artifact that feeds on living people. If you want to investigate, you can try to pay attention to the case of Backlund's disappearance." Speaking of this, Alger seemed to have thought of something, with a familiar sarcasm in his words. "If he has entered the East District, then this information will be meaningless. After all, it is hard for you to imagine how many people die every day in such a factory area." When Audrey heard this, she couldn't help frowning and opened her mouth, but in the end she didn't say anything. She turned to thinking that if creeping hunger had to be used at the cost of human life, then she would have no interest in it. She had a natural discomfort with this evil thing that craved the blood and soul of living people, and was very disgusted. Audrey paused, ignoring the sarcasm from the hanged man just now. Just when she was about to ask for more details, she heard the little son, who had been excluded due to geographical factors from the beginning of the discussion, suddenly exclaimed. "A sentence, Shepherd! Shepherd!" Justice and the hanged man turned their heads to the son at the same time. They were very surprised that the little son seemed to be able to guess which sequence wriggling hunger belonged to, but was completely curious compared to Justice. The hanged man is more like having heard a similar name, and at this moment has a great interest and wants to dig out more information. Although Son couldn't help but panic because of everyone's reaction, he still told in detail all the information he knew about Shepherd. After several discussions, although Alger had given up hope, he still provided Kailingus' portrait to Justice. Seeing that the discussion and sharing had come to an end, Klein quickly ended the meeting and cut off contact with everyone's salute. It has been determined that Son can contact his Klein normally through prayer. At this time, he has already changed into his formal clothes. He will go to Henry's private investigative office to check the progress of the investigation on Red Chimney that he had entrusted before. East District, a neighborhood controlled by the Hualai Party, outside a pale yellow building populated by watchmakers. Ambrosius hid himself under the broken street sign, and was looking at the crystal ball reflecting the crimson moonlight in his hand according to the traces left by the container of uncertain mist on the ground. Divination her whereabouts. Generally speaking, a demigod would never leave very obvious traces when moving, not to mention that she has a level 0 sealed artifact of the apprentice pathway. But judging from the traces left on the ground, she is obviously injured now, and her means of roaming have also been deprived, so she can barely escape by relying on the assassin's own invisibility, combined with the powerful distortion. The only one who can restrain a demigod with a level 0 sealed item in Backlund is Lone's founder, the Sequence 1 Hand of Order of the Judge pathway, William Augustus can do. Thinking of this, Ambrosius couldn't help but feel annoyed. If it wasn't for the Wind-Blessed who used the Shepherd's corresponding sealed item yesterday to make too many murders, the mist of uncertainty distorted his divination results. Led himself in the completely opposite direction, and he could join forces with Augustus to kill that container. However, why does the divination result tell me that not killing the Wind-Blessed is the best choice? Ambrosius put away the crystal ball in his hand while recalling the results of yesterday's divination. He didn't get any feedback, he could only confirm that she was still in Backlund, and she was lurking somewhere. He raised his head and looked towards the direction of Sodric Palace, like a swarm of flaming worms. The bright city lights shimmering in the haze of Backlund seemed to be struggling with something. After a few struggles, Ambrosius whispered the honorable name of a certain existence as if resigning his fate, the embodiment of ancient legends. A symbol of mystery and rebirth. The immortal butterfly that walks with Jing Guang under the mysterious seat. The great Edmund Jason the corrupter. Along with the whispered prayers in the silent night sky, the nearly solidified sludge on the ground in the eastern district suddenly bubbled up, like cocoons embedded in the mud. They absorbed the filth around them and kept expanding. Suddenly, the cocoons in the mud burst one after another, and illusory butterflies of blue and purple flew out. They were bathed in the dim red light of the red moon, flapping their wings and rolled up the remaining mud on the ground, combining with the light in the air. Intertwined into a mixed figure. He is composed of moonlight and night butterfly, and there is thick black mud hanging on his body. The strange thing is that the black mud can't soak and contaminate him even a little. Ambrosius looked at the childish trick of the colleague in front of him, and said angrily, "Do you have to be so official every time?" Following his sarcasm, the illusory butterflies on the hybrid humanoid body scattered and flew in all directions, leaving only one smiling, dressed in gorgeous formal clothes, with a half-length light grey color. Men with curly hair. Edmund Jason smiled and said carelessly, "It's just my style. I thought you've gotten used to it for over 1,000 years. Tell me, what's the matter? You won't contact me if you don't encounter a big problem." The next morning, Klein walked down Zoetland Road with his head down, recalling Ms. Daly's late-night visit last night. Maybe I can really summon myself according to the method taught by Ms. Daly? But if the grey fog is really alive, who is it that I summoned? But after so long, it hasn't changed much since the eternal blazing sun divination. It was probably just a stress reaction before. I can gather some knowledge about summoning, and then I will summon myself when I am sure. Oh, it's like Yu-Gi-Oh! Klein couldn't help laughing, and immediately turned serious, returning to his serious expression. He had already reached the door of number 36 Zoetland Street. Yesterday, he promised Ms. Daly that he would secretly hand over the acting method to the captain. Klein took a deep breath and gently opened the door. After greeting Roshan, he walked directly to the partition and knocked on the door of the captain's office. "Come in." Dunn's mellow voice came out. As soon as Klein walked in, he saw that the captain had already sat up straight, picked up the jacket in his hand, and looked like he was about to solve the problem. Seeing this, Klein couldn't help but startled, and the corners of his mouth twitched. "I'm not a smart person," he complained in Chinese in his heart and immediately started talking about the business. "Captain, I have something to report to you." When Dunn heard Klein's words, he nodded slightly and asked in a low voice, "Is there any extraordinary event?" Klein looked at the serious Dunn Smith and suddenly smiled. "No, there is nothing extraordinary, it's just that I figured out one thing yesterday." Dunn was stunned for a while, put down the clothes in his hand, leaned back slightly against the back of the chair, and relaxed slightly. "What's the matter?" He repeated the question just now. Klein found a chair at random and sat down, deliberately making his movements look more casual. "Actually, I went to see Dr. Duster at the madhouse yesterday, the audience of the Psychology Alchemy Society." Klein recalled the belly draft he had thought of before. "When he was reporting to me, he mentioned a beyonder disguised as a patient in the madhouse. Well, he was a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist was recently trying to treat the patients in the insane asylum, and the potion was digested to a certain extent. Moreover, according to that person's suggestion, Dr. Duster also mastered the audience potion in a relatively short period of time. I also summed up my own experience at home yesterday. I think that we can use the name of the potion to play, which seems to speed up the speed at which we can control the potion. It's like we're trying to master a newly mastered skill, and we can only master this skill better if we keep practicing. However, acting is not just a mechanical exercise of extraordinary abilities. I think there is also a hidden rule that can avoid negative effects. This rule can help us better understand the sequence we are in, and recognize our current situation. Achieving digestion, not just mechanical mastery. I myself summed up the fortune teller's code during the fortune-telling club, and shortly after that, the ravings and hallucinations that plagued me also disappeared. If it's just mechanical mastery instead of digestion, then it's very likely to become lost in the influence of potions like that psychiatrist. Before Klein could finish speaking, Dunn raised his head, which had been half bowed because he listened carefully. Is there something wrong with that psychiatrist? Klein twitched the corners of his mouth, almost covering his face with his hands. Captain, isn't the point of acting? He exhaled and smiled. Dr. Duster has been observing him for a while. He was just too obsessed with treating those patients, which affected his thinking. I think since he still has the energy to imitate some Intis customs, he should not question. Hearing this, Dunn nodded, but he didn't say anything about the Intis customs. He just lowered his head again, sat in the chair and meditated quietly. His grey eyes became deeper. He was silent for more than 10 seconds, and in a rare case, he completely relaxed his body, leaned back in the chair, raised his head, stared blankly at the ceiling, and seemed to have forgotten Klein's existence. After a long time, he came back to his senses and remembered Klein's existence. Dunn rubbed his brows, as if he had forgotten the internal rules of the Nighthawks. He took out a match, lit his pipe, took a breath, and said in a somber tone, "I'm sorry, but I forgot that you don't smoke. I think things are a little lost." "Smoking is bad for your health," Klein replied solemnly. Dunn held his pipe, stared at the letter on the table, and thought for a while. "I seem to have figured out some things too. Daly said something similar before, but I didn't understand it at the time. I just practiced my extraordinary abilities as usual." Daly was promoted and left shortly after that. Dunn took a deep breath of his pipe, highlighted the mint-flavored smoke, and joked in a complicated tone, "Perhaps, it doesn't take long for you to submit a special application and be promoted to Sequence 8. Klein didn't know the atmosphere and asked the captain when he could submit it. He just took out his pocket watch and looked at it. On the pretext of going to Old Neil to learn about the mysticism, he turned around and left the office, leaving the time to himself. Team leader. Xiaolu Tamara Treville panted low, and half leaned against a wall of the sewer in the western district of Backlund. All around her was a ceremonial pattern made up of broken limbs of people of all ages, and the air was filled with a peculiar scent of an enticing sense. Irregularly shaped, dense and light white mist wrapped around her body, moving one by one, like the lungs of a giant beast when it was breathing. On her neck, the blue-purple gemstone lying impartially between the collarbones reflected the faint light, and the silver chain connected with the gemstones had also melted, and together with the blue-purple gemstone, it was branded into the girl's snow-white, silky ground. In the skin, Xiaolu kept scratching her body, and light red marks continued to grow on her body. With the broken and messy clothes, she showed an indescribable sense of charm. She stretched her slender, white neck, her eyes were tightly closed, her face was flushed unnaturally, and her breathing rate gradually synchronized with the surrounding white mist that seemed to be breathing. At this moment, the broken bodies scattered around suddenly ignited black flames, which decomposed into countless scarlet light spots. The blue-purple gemstone between Xiaolu's collarbone also suddenly burst into a huge light, which suddenly broke her body into pieces, but under the shackles of the white mist, it didn't burst into blood and splashed all over the floor. The white mist that was shrinking and squirming irregularly suddenly shrank, and the countless light spots floating around were thrown into the white mist, connecting with each other. With the blue-purple gem as the core, it turned into a mass of flesh scattered around. The blood-colored chains pulled the blood clot back little by little, and recondensed into the appearance of Xiaolu Tamara Treville. Xiaolu, who has reconsolidated her figure, is no longer surrounded by white mist, but has a white dress woven with plain yarn on her body, and a blue-purple one is also branded on her collarbone, mixed with a long sword, a crown, and a snake head. Doors and many other symbols of the elements. Just as he took a step forward, he suddenly knelt to the ground due to weakness in his limbs. When he looked back, he found that his legs had collapsed into strange worms with snake heads that seemed to be cast from stars. He tumbled on the ground in pain, wisps of smoke composed of spirituality were squeezed out of him and scattered into the air, and a beautiful, pure girl's face could be vaguely seen, crying bitterly. After the smoke completely dissipated, Xia Lu's limbs had returned to their original state, and she got up from the ground. He turned his head to look at the wall of the sewer behind him. His line of sight seemed to penetrate the barrier, and then he looked at what was hidden behind it. Roussel's little toy, Mother's Nest is really bad fun. He smiled lightly, his figure flickered, and quietly disappeared in place. Klein just got off the carriage, and under the guidance of the house number, he came to the door of Isaac's house. Sure enough, no matter what era or world you are in, a university lecturer is a decent enough profession. Klein looked at the decoration of Isaac's house and thought to himself. When? Klein gently pulled the rope at the door and rang the bell in the house. After more than 10 seconds, a gentleman with bronze skin, black hair and brown eyes, soft facial features, and a face with obvious Balaam characteristics, Isaac Eggers, a professor of history at Horn University, opened the door. Since he was at home, Mr. Isaac just casually wore a white shirt, brown vest, and brown trousers. Klein, I was just about to write you a letter saying that I have returned home. Isaac said in surprise, filled with obvious enthusiasm. Klein took a deep look at the small black mole under Mr. Isaac's right ear, and said in a calm tone, Mr. Isaac, I think I have found a clue about your past. Really? Isaac's calm and soft face rarely fluctuated, and his eyes that contained the vicissitudes of life lost their indifference. He glanced outside the door and said hurriedly, let's go in and talk. Isaac stepped aside, led Klein into the living room on the first floor, and greeted Klein to sit on the soft sofa together. What did you find? He asked impatiently. Klein originally thought that he was just leaving a note today, so he could only think while organizing his words and said, I accepted a commission before to deal with a grievance in an ancient castle outside the town of Ramd. When Isaac heard this place name, he seemed to recall something, and frowned a little. What kind of old castle did you solve for that resentful spirit? Is it the one in Baron Ramd's domain? Klein looked at the other party's expression. After hearing this sudden question, Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com had a bad premonition. I won't kill the people that the big guy knows. Klein guessed in horror, and gradually slowed down his speech. In a small town, a villager sold me one. It is said that it was a portrait of the first Baron Ramd. I found that the person on the portrait was very similar to you, so I went to the castle to look for more clues. During the exploration, I accidentally bumped into the resentful spirit wandering there. In order to protect myself, I purified him. After hearing this, Isaac frowned even more. Suddenly, some voices sounded in his mind as if from afar, stabbing his thoughts like sharp needles. Those voices were calling him, Dad, Sir, Your Excellency. He couldn't help leaning forward, his fingers crossed in front of his nose, like a statue. He was silent for a long time before he said, then, maybe it's someone I once knew. Although I don't know why he became a resentful spirit, it is a good thing to be able to be purified and free from pain. Klein, can you take me there? Sure enough, it was someone Mr. Isaac knew. Klein saw that the big guy didn't take anger at him, and replied, yes, but I need to go home now, otherwise my brother and sister will worry about me. Isaac stood up with a swipe, no problem. The two immediately took the carriage to Daffodil Street. After Klein briefly explained to Melissa, they sat in the hired carriage with Isaac and spent nearly 3 hours arriving at Ramd town at night. Isaac got off the carriage, stepped on the cold, hard dirt road, looked around the surroundings, his expression became more and more solemn, he seemed to be looking for something. Suddenly, he didn't say a word, and walked straight to the road leading to Baron Ramder's castle, which forced Klein, who was instructing the driver to wait behind him, to quickly pay the money and turn around to follow. Along the way, Isaac resisted the obstruction of darkness, and only relied on the crimson moon that occasionally penetrated the clouds and the faint light of trivial stars to identify the road. He walked faster and faster, forcing Klein behind him to trot to catch up. Klein even suspects that Mr. Arts is now relying on the guidance of memory to identify the direction, and he doesn't even need light to illuminate the road. Finally, at the entrance of the castle, Klein caught up with Isaac. He wanted to say something, but after looking at the other party's silent face and tightly pursed lips, he wisely swallowed the words back in his stomach. Isaac stared at the ancient castle in front of him that had collapsed, more than half of it was destroyed, and was almost in ruins. His eyes were sometimes deep and sometimes blurred, until he seemed to find something. His eyes kept moving with the target that didn't exist in the air, passing over the barren lawn, over the front hall of the old castle full of weeds, and over the tower that had collapsed into a floor of broken bricks. Suddenly, he groaned in pain, his footsteps could not help but retreat, and the muscles on his face were twisted to the point of hideousness. There were several pale flames all around him, the clothes on his back bulged high, and a pair of pure white wings broke out. The pale flame burns out. In just a few seconds, Isaac had turned into a half-human, half-snake monster covered with dark green snake scales and carrying huge wings. A thick grey-white mist rose from the ground out of thin air, covering Isaac's figure. Klein instinctively wanted to escape in front of this sudden change, but found himself surrounded by spirits around him. The spirits in the entire castle territory were trembling, crawling on the ground, as if welcoming the returning lord. This is too exaggerated, Mr. Isaac is at least a sequence 5 or above, he won't lose control. I can't even take 4 steps backward. Klein tentatively looked at the magnificent scene in front of him and couldn't help thinking. As the last feather was burnt away by the pale flames, Isaac gradually returned to normal, his face was covered with tears, as if he had just experienced a very sad dream. He looked at Klein, who was held in the distance by many spirit bodies, and raised his hand to drive away the nearby spirits. Although Klein regained his freedom, the limbs that were bound by the spirit were still cold and weak, and he couldn't even drive his legs to escape. He could only activate his spirit vision and asked carefully, "Mr. Isaac, are you all right?" Arts didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Klein carefully with suppressed sadness. After realizing that he had found something familiar and fortunate, he forced a smile and wiped his face. Tears, and replied in a dreamy tone, "I have recovered some of my memories, and I have also seen some recent events." "Well, this is what a nearby spirit told me. Klein, thank you very much for helping Horiko get out of trouble. It is a better destination for him to return to the kingdom of God after being purified than to become a resentful spirit and endure malicious torture." Horiko? Klein wondered, is this the name of the Wraith Knight? Seeing Klein's puzzled face and a little wary, Isaac explained in a calm tone, "Horiko is my son. He is a brave boy who has been determined to become a knight since he was 7 or 8 years old, and runs around dragging a giant sword. Here, this is the territory when I was Baron Rumd. It was the original home of my wife and I still remember it in its entirety. Although I have already remembered something, in the deepest part of the castle, what happened to the resting place of Horiko seems to be interfered by something. I want to confirm it myself. You can wait for me where you are, and of course you can follow." After that, Mr. Isaac turned and walked towards the depths of the castle. Klein looked at the color of Isaac's aura. He had been using his spiritual vision to observe the other party's emotional changes. He could be sure that Mr. Isaac had really recovered his memory and was not interested in people. Feel sad. However, he was still afraid of the sudden change just now, and he couldn't believe the other party's words. What if Mr. Isaac was out of control? In case he is tempting. No, just based on the strength that Mr. Isaac showed just now, it would be no more difficult for him to kill me than to crush a bug. After thinking for a while, Klein still caught up with the other party's footsteps, passed through the gate together, watched the other party skillfully found the mechanism, and walked into the basement. Klein held his cane, and just after he caught up with Mr. Azek and entered the basement, he saw that he was slowly pushing open the lid of the coffin in the center of the basement. He just pushed open a gap, and through the gap, Azek saw the headless white bone. His expression suddenly twisted, his eyes were tightly closed, and he let out a whimper that seemed to be sad and painful. Klein can clearly feel that Mr. Azek is very angry now, and this basement has become even colder than when the Wraith Knight was there before. In just over an hour since he came to the small town of Ramd, he has been shocked too many times by what happened to Mr. Azek. Azek slowly opened his eyes, still staring at the corpse of his child in the coffin. His tone was as cold as ice. I found the force that made your fate uncoordinated, and he was also the murderer who desecrated Horiko's body. Then, can it be traced back to the murderer? Klein asked cautiously. The murderer who lived in the Red Chimney House not only secretly made a coincidence, but also found the place where Mr. Azek once lived and took the head of the corpse of his blood relatives. What exactly does he want to do? What is there to achieve at the risk of offending a terrifying Beyonder? It's been too long. It's easy to fail if you rely solely on the relationship of blood, but there are other things that can be used here. Azek's deep voice seemed to contain a volcano that was about to erupt. Something else? Klein asked curiously. Azek walked to a corner of the basement, turned his back to Klein, blocking his vision, stretched out his right hand, and pressed it directly on an ordinary brick. The environment in the basement suddenly became extremely cold and cold. The surface of his right palm was instantly corroded, and the seeped blood turned into a pool of purple-black sludge. The entire arm was also injured, and it was spontaneously covered with dark green, snake scales covered with mysterious patterns. Azek's expression became extremely indifferent, and his aura also became gloomy and majestic, as if he was gradually sliding towards another personality. The unremarkable wall brick seemed to have absorbed enough blood, as if it was erased by an eraser, and the traces quickly faded away, leaving only the evaporating sludge and a notebook hidden in the wall. Azek took out the note from the wall with his intact left hand, and an illusory orchid flame floated on the surface of his right hand, which quickly healed his wound. He took the notebook and walked to the coffin, mobilizing the spirituality left in his child's corpse in the coffin. Wow! 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 Klein suddenly heard the cry of the baby, and felt indescribable gazes from all directions. He turned around abruptly, pulled out the revolver, raised his gun on the spot and looked around, and found that Azek was still standing very calmly in front of the coffin, but the surrounding space seemed to have lost the concept of up, down, left and right, and everywhere was filled with incomprehensible abstract symbols. 7 auras blocked the sky, and the basement at this time was like the spiritual world described in the Nighthawk's data. Suddenly, Klein saw a cloud of fog emerging around him, and it seemed that there were countless huge beasts with flame-like eyes hiding in it. At this time, Azek held up the note was automatically opened, golden flames rose from the page, and several streams of information glowing green gathered together, attached to the page, and condensed into paragraphs. Written in Elvish language. Seeing this, Azek closed his notes, and all the abnormalities around him disappeared instantly, and the basement returned to what it was when he and Klein first came in. He looked at the extra words in the note, he couldn't help but let out a long sigh, and handed the note to Klein. Because it involves a level 0 sealed artifact, there are only some vague clues recorded on it. I can't get an accurate conclusion. I can only guess based on some intuition. Oh, this notebook has a certain relationship with the fortune tellers, so it may help you, but you must be careful not to read out the contents at will. Azek explained in a low voice as he turned and closed the lid of the coffin. Klein curiously glanced at the cover of the note. After finding nothing unusual, he immediately comforted the other party, "Don't worry, it's normal not to find it." After looking down at his son's coffin for a while, Azek turned around slowly and led Klein away from the castle, walking in the direction of a carriage. On the road, his mood was still low, and when he saw the carriage still parked in the dark, he said in a low voice, "When this matter passes, I think I will resign and leave Tingen, and go to a familiar place in my memory to find my past. Klein couldn't hide the curiosity in his heart. He didn't feel like he grasped the note in his hand, and asked, "Mr. Azek, do you know what happened to you?" Azek stopped abruptly, and the surroundings became quiet, only Yexiao's cry and crisp insect chirping still echoed on the barren road. He was silent for a few seconds. I may be someone who has lived a long time. I only remember that at the end of the Fourth Era, I escaped a very dangerous existence with the help of a friend, and of course I paid the price for it, just like now. I lost most of my memory and can only be resurrected again and again, living a different life. No, maybe it wasn't a friend, but... Azek suddenly fell into silence. He seemed to recall something, and it seemed that it was difficult to think about the important part. His thoughts suddenly slipped to the edge of time and space. After a long time, it was not until the coachman rang the bell impatiently that he came back to his senses. That seems to be another great being. It's getting late today. Thank you for coming here with me. Seeing that Azek's thoughts were no longer entangled in the past, Klein hurriedly took the opportunity to mention, "Mr. Azek, I wonder if I could ask you to do me a trivial favor." Azek nodded lightly and said, "What do you need me to do?" Klein said it while organizing the language, asking the other party to help him create a chance to take out 30,782. Azek looked into Klein's eyes, suddenly smiled, turned around quickly, and said, "No problem, I will tell you the location and time in advance, enough for you to prepare." Klein listened to this kind of response, the corner of his mouth twitched. He immediately got into the carriage and left the town of Ramd. At 11:30 at night, Klein returned home. Fighting against fatigue and hunger, he tried his best to suppress the sound of his actions, for fear of waking up Benson and Melissa, who were already asleep. But as soon as he entered the living room to find something to eat, he found Benson's back slightly lonely under the elegant gas lamp. Benson was sitting alone on the sofa, covered in the soft, warm light from a gas lamp, reading a grammar-related book in ecstasy. He seemed to have sensed the footsteps behind him, and just as he was about to turn his head to look, he couldn't help but yawned. "Ha, Klein, have you finished helping that teacher? Mr. Arts found some cultural relics in his hometown, and he asked me to do related exploration and protection work together." After speaking, Klein waved the notes on his hand. "This is an unimportant book. Note, Mr. Azek gave it to me when he found it was of little value. Anyway, the territory where you lived for decades can be considered your hometown, right?" He took Melissa's dinner from the kitchen and ate it. Benson obviously didn't care, and yawned again. "I have to go to bed. Since I started studying grammar and reading those classics, my sleep quality has become very good. Now I can fall asleep as soon as I touch the bed." Klein remembered the civil service exam. He tried his best to swallow the meal he just ate, took a sip of water and said, "There is a reward for hard work. You know, our company has some relationship with the National Police Agency. I heard some inside information. The big guys above seem to be tired of the procrastination and inefficient government, and are planning to reform the employment mechanism, recruiting by public examination. Picking the capable ones and replacing the officials who are unable to fill the current jobs." Benson's originally blurred eyes suddenly became energetic, lowered his voice, and asked excitedly, "Is it a public exam, like the university lecturer exam?" Seeing that Benson had taken the bait, Klein briefly introduced Benson to the possible content of the civil service exam in the future, and finally reminded him, "Of course you shouldn't have too much hope in this matter, after all, no one knows whether he will be passed." With a smile on Benson's face, he yawned again, "But if I can pass, then this will be a good opportunity. Of course, even if I can't pass, the knowledge I have learned is enough to help me find a better job. You are a living example in front of me." Seeing that Benson had understood, Klein let him go upstairs with the other party, while he quickly finished the dinner on the plate, and went straight back to the bedroom after packing, locking the door behind him. He stood in front of the window, looking at the street scene bathed in the crimson moonlight outside the window. The street was empty and silent, only the slight sound of his own breathing could be heard. He closed the curtains all at once, looked at the notes in his hand, forced himself up, pulled out the ritual silver dagger, and created a wall of spirituality to seal the entire room. After taking 4 steps backwards, Klein once again came above the grey fog. The grey and hazy mist filled the air as if it had never changed, and the crimson illusory stars and the constellations formed by them occupied the entire sky. Klein sat in the majestic palace like the residence of a giant. After examining it carefully, he withdrew his gaze. "Prepare to divination the summoning ritual that you got from Ms. Daly." He skillfully embodied the banknotes and wrote down the incantations and divination sentences for the summoning ceremony. "It would be dangerous for me to use the above ritual to summon myself." The citron he held in his left hand slowly turned counterclockwise, denying the danger of performing the summoning ceremony. Klein didn't try directly, but tried to embody the note that Mr. Azek gave him just now. Under his attempt, a vague outline floated above the long bronze table. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't solidify it until he was about to give up, and when he was ready to wave away the vague outline, one book was the same as the one in reality. Identical notes fell out of blurry outlines. The notebook that Klein looked at in amazement, his feeling just now told him that he seemed to have escaped the notebook directly from the void. He didn't immediately flip through the notes to check the contents. Instead, he summoned a pen and paper again, and said, "The origin of this note." Mr. Azek didn't find anything, so he should be fine. Klein thought. Randomly, he recited it silently 7 times, leaned back on the back of the chair, and entered a dream state. The dream this time was very clear, and Klein could clearly see the details of the surrounding buildings. It's a quaint but sophisticated city built on a reef that sprawls along the beach, full of primitive frescoes and baker's patchwork. In normal times, this must have been a beautiful city, but now, it is covered with scratches of giant dragons and traces of flames, and the ground is littered with the stumps and arms of dead elves, and even a complete corpse is hard to see. With a clatter, a blue cracked face, a gentle and beautiful man pushed away the rubble and climbed out of the rubble. He looked crazy and indifferent, holding a blood-stained notebook tightly in his hand. In Klein's sight, the blood on the notebook was slowly fading, and a vague and eerie symbol protruded from the cover. At this point, the picture in front of him suddenly shattered, and Klein's consciousness was dragged into the next scene. It was still the man with the blue crack on his face. Half of his body collapsed and twisted into a huge tentacle that was extended from countless transparent worms. The tentacles were entwined with bursting thunder, and he was surrounded by the wind, laughed wildly in the air, waved his tentacles, and hit the bird-shaped behemoth in front of him with all his strength. This picture was extremely blurry, and before Klein could see it clearly, it changed into a new scene. The soft-faced man's face is no longer covered with cracks, and he is confronting a huge figure sitting on a coral throne. The figure was indistinct, as if it was covered by a pool of paint, while the gentle-faced man had gloomy eyes and a frosty face. The figure on the coral throne suddenly became furious, and struck the man with several thick lightning bolts. Klein's eyes flashed, only to see one hand handing over the note. Mr. Azek, who was wearing the ancient lord costume, was instantly thrown out of the dream. He rubbed his brows, which were aching from fatigue, and recalled the few pictures he had just seen. Is this the relic of an ancient elf powerhouse? He survived by relying on this item in the dragon's attack. Later, he provoked a certain existence. After successfully escaping, his body was seriously injured and there was no hope of recovery, so he gave the note to Mr. Azek. The rest is all my guesswork. After all, in the end, I didn't show the state of the strong man at all, and I didn't even show who the hand really belonged to. Maybe he was killed by the huge figure that split the lightning, and the owner of the huge figure gave the note to Mr. Azek. After all, Mr. Azek also mentioned that he got out of the crisis with the help of a great being. Alas, the boss didn't finish his words at that time. Besides, the great existence who masters thunder and lightning, is it the Lord of the Storm? Klein thought hard for a long time, and found no results, so he decisively skipped the exploration of the notes, and he had no idea of in-depth divination. Since the last time he accidentally divination eternal blazing sun, after the fire was burned, Klein has understand a truth, don't die. He turned to research on another matter, extended his spirituality to wrap himself around, simulated the feeling of falling sharply, and returned to the real world. After returning to the bedroom, Klein quickly arranged the summoning ceremony, stepped back to the center of the room, looked at the candle that symbolized him, and whispered in giant language, I. Then he immediately switched to Hermes language and continued to recite, I call in my name. Klein endured the dual torture of lack of spirituality and mental fatigue, and looked at the candle light that had swelled and spread out and was dyed with a grey sheen, but there was no change, and he felt a little dazed. Immediately, he pinched his stinging forehead and silently said to himself, I'm calling myself, and I'm still standing here. If someone really responded to me, it would be really scary. He slowed down for more than 10 seconds, then took 4 steps against the grey fog again, and saw that the top of the long bronze table where he usually sat was swinging in circles of light patterns that spread continuously. In the center of the light pattern was a strange symbol composed of crimson rays of light that was the strange symbol composed of eyes without pupils and twisted lines on the back of Klein's high-backed chair. He just stretched out his hand and touched the circle of light patterns, and the scene of himself chanting the incantation just now appeared in front of him. Door. Klein gave him the instruction to open the door, and the crimson stars and boundless mist on the grey fog also seemed to be pulled. The ripples generated by the surging grey fog kept rushing towards the illusory gate, pounding one after another, as if trying to fill in the other side. But no matter how it fluctuated, the gate was always in an unformed state, and it seemed that all the influx of power had been strangely grafted to another place. Klein felt the pain in his brain becoming more and more unbearable, so he could only give up the attempt and withdraw his thoughts. Is it because of my own lack of spirituality that I can't make the Gate of Summoning really take shape? He looked ahead suspiciously. Gate of Summoning was the name he just gave. Perhaps when I get promoted to Sequence 8, I can mobilize more spirituality, and I can try to build a complete summoning gate after I get it. Well, I can't try it during the dangerous period of my promotion. If I mobilize too much spirituality in the dangerous period of the early promotion stage, I may lose control. I have to wait until I can't hear the ravings at all before I can try. After Ryan finished thinking about the plan, he nodded slightly. Holding the excitement that he had just discovered a new secret, he quickly wrapped himself in spirituality and returned to reality. After all, no matter how excited you are because of the discovery, people still have to sleep, especially the daegong workers who have to go to work tomorrow morning. As soon as Klein tightened the quilt, his thoughts completely sank into the dream state, and he immediately regained consciousness passively in a daze. The captain won't come again, will he? He was dumbfounded and found himself paralyzed on the sofa in the living room, while Dunn had crossed the hallway, walked in with a cane, sat opposite him, smoking a cigarette like that, looking straight at him. Follow him. Captain, I need a rest. Klein has no love for life. Backlund West District, behind the Phillips department store, back door. Several carriages used to pull goods were neatly parked in a straight line. Tall brown or black horses buried their heads in the manger, eating the forage that the coachman had just put in. Because it is the most high-end department store in the Lone Kingdom, and it is also a well-known social place for the nobles and the rich, the Phillips department store's staff treatment is also much higher than other companies. Take the delivery coachman as an example. Compared to the most common hired coachmen in Backlund City, they only need to work 8 hours a day, on duty every day according to the schedule, and also arrange shifts on weekends to ensure that each employee can work within a month. Taking a break within the house, of course, the recruitment requirements are also much higher. It is now 12:30 am in Backlund. The hot sun rarely pierces the thick fog that has accumulated in Backlund all the year round, dispelling the cold and dampness that plagued most citizens. This is the lunch break for most employees of Philip's company. At the time, only a small number of people were on duty to ensure the operation of the store, and in the stables behind the store, there was only one hapless man sleeping in the lounge and eating dry bread. Suddenly, a petite, shoulder-length blonde girl in a knight's uniform took advantage of her body and slipped out of a parabolic tube that was obediently attached to the back wall of the department store building. Following her inertia, she put her hands on the ground, tightened her body, and rolled into the manger one by one. The horse that was concentrating on grazing was frightened by the girl who suddenly rolled over. It looked at the girl's rough, half-long hair that was difficult to obey. After thinking about it, it lowered its head again, ready to take a bite. The girl felt the sudden heat on her head, and when she looked up suddenly, she saw that the horse who wanted to bite her was staring, as if she saw something surprising enough and was about to neigh. Before the horse could scream, he felt a huge and invisible pressure, suddenly became extremely gentle, lowered his head again, and ate the grass obediently, as if nothing had happened. That girl was the famous arbiter in the eastern district of Backlund, Hudilcha. She looked at the horse pacified by the deterrence she had just released, and without tidying up her clothes, she rushed out of the back street of Philip's store and quickly got on the stagecoach to Hillston. Zio pushed open the wooden door of the apartment, looked familiarly at the corridor behind him, and closed it after confirming that no one was there. As soon as she entered the living room, she saw her roommate Furzwal was half paralyzed on the easy chair, her lips were slightly open, her eyes were blank, her right hand was drooping weakly, and a round belly was hanging on her index and middle fingers to absorb water. Pen. Furcy seemed to hear the creaking sound of the door, but she didn't get up to check, but continued to slump on the easy chair, making a rotten sound. Hugh, meal, I'm so hungry. I remember that I left enough bread. Hugh ignored his roommate and his indecent appearance, walked straight to the closed curtain, and pulled it open. The huge movement of the curtains caused a burst of dust, and the dazzling sunlight quickly occupied the entire apartment, killing the lazy rice bug hidden in the shadows. Ah, why are you pulling the curtains? Furcy jumped up from the easy chair. I just fell into a bottleneck period, I need inspiration, and inspiration doesn't need sunlight. Zio took off his night uniform, pulled Furcy, who was going to the kitchen to find food, and sat on the sofa together. He unfolded what had been hidden on his body before, which Miss Audrey gave to him, Lieutenant General Hurricane A sketch of Zeilingers. Furs picked up the sketch suspiciously and studied it carefully. What is this? Furs asked. As Zio adjusted his sitting posture and relaxed his tired body from sneaking out of the Phillips store, he replied, this is given to me by Miss Audrey, saying that she is looking for the person above, the great pirate Kylingus, his bounty in loan is 10,000 pounds. The unique wide chin, the ancient knight's bun, the eyes with a cold smile. Such a special hairstyle, in Backlund, is like a firefly in the night. Is this really 10,000 pounds? Furcy couldn't help but said, and then she read the additional description below, and saw that the target has the ability to transform into other people's appearance, and the duration is unknown. Then what is the use of this sketch like? Furcy raised his head in confusion, looked at Zio who was concentrating on him, and said to himself, it's impossible to find a foreigner who can become someone else. There are countless foreigners in Backlund. Furcy suddenly became discouraged, changed back to the way Zio was before returning home, and went back paralyzed. Zio looked at the lazy and depraved look of her roommate in front of her, as if she was used to it. She just took the sketch in her hand that recorded the information, and didn't even mean to blame her. She read it carefully and found that there are many additional descriptions, so she read it out in a low voice. 1. There is a very evil item on Kylingus' body, which devours the flesh and soul of a living person every other day. 2. It is recommended to collect information about Kylingus in detail. Although he can change his appearance, he has not done disguise training, so he will always behave like himself, and there will be problems in some behavioral habits. Percy seemed to want to say something when she heard this. She was trying hard to support her body, intending to pull out her body that was stuck in the sofa. She tried 2 or 3 times, and then gave up the struggle and adjusted wriggly. Try to make yourself look less decadent with your own sitting position. She took out the cigarette case pressed under her buttocks, nodded slightly and said, Miss Audrey doesn't seem to be as naive and simple as rumored, she has enough delicate heart and calm observation. Zio glared at Percy, who was about to take out cigarettes from the cigarette case, and asked, Really, I never found out. Since you're so keen, it's better for me to be in charge of finding it, and you're in charge of collecting and summarizing the pile of gold lists. No, what are the hobbies and characteristics of that pirate general? Percy's eyes widened, he calmly put down the cigarette in his hand, and asked, How can you bear it? Look at my recent state. I'm already very busy with the new book. The requirements of readers are getting stricter and stricter. I have to come up with more complicated and interesting plots. How can you bear to let the present I'm in a state of dilapidation to undertake such a heavy task again? Zio glanced at her friend, and unconsciously revealed convincing majesty, I only saw you being lazy at home recently. This is an opportunity for us to make money. Isn't there a very good reasoning in your storm house? Percy tightened her body, buried her head in her arms, and muttered, You have no idea how much hair I lost for that reasoning when you went out. Readers are sending letters every day, and editors have repeatedly threatened to come to check my progress. You don't know how many nights I stayed up. We slept together. Zio looked at the pitiful appearance of her roommate huddled into a ball on the sofa. She felt a little distressed for a while, and was almost fooled to give comfort. She lowered her voice deliberately, and her tender voice became low, trying to highlight the majesty of the arbiter, Then do you have any other way? Percy saw that he no longer had to deal with it by himself. After thinking for 10 seconds, he raised his head abruptly and said, We can hire professionals to do it. All we need to do is gather information about the Lieutenant General Hurricane, then erase the name and hand it over to a detective who is good at summarizing, which not only requires the necessary consulting fees, but also saves time. Zio looked at the roommate who suddenly became energetic in front of him, froze in place, and Percy looked at each other. The air was full of speechless embarrassment. Cough, yes. Zio cleared his throat, just as you said, consult the detective. Of course, you will pay for the cost. Percy, who was originally happy because he didn't have to stay up all night to sort out the data, heard this, and the smile on his face solidified. You forgot to say when you came in just now that you have a few ears of wheat growing on your head. After speaking, Furs quickly stood up, jumped up, and fled to the bedroom, leaving only Hugh, who was stunned, with a few ears of wheat stuck in his head. Klein pushed open the door of number 36 Zoetland Street while recalling the contents of Mr. Isaac's letter, I will go to Morristown on Sunday and return on Wednesday. He and Rojan skillfully greeted him and saw that the door to the captain's office was open at the partition position, so the corners of his mouth evoked an inconspicuous smile, and he deliberately let go of the volume and said, Yesterday at the Divination Club, I met a girl who is very similar to you. This topic really aroused Luo Shan's interest. She put down the Tianjin City Honest News in her hand, and asked back, Real? Klein nodded insincerely, and when he answered, he turned to pay attention to the direction of the captain's office. Really, you reading www.yuyuganshu.com? I thought she was your sister, and your personalities are very similar. That disappoints you. I have no sisters, only a distant brother. Rojan replied with a smile. Maybe it's your brother. If I really saw such a girl. Klein thought of tries before, and thought maliciously in his mind. By the way, is Klein's Divination Club fun? Rojan asked casually. That's work, ma'am. It's my usual job to master potions and get more information. Klein chuckled, however, I do encounter a lot of interesting things. Luo Shan suddenly became interested and asked curiously, what is it? You know, compared to the job where you can walk every day, I can only sit here bored. The captain's door is still open. Complaining about work at work is a taboo in the workplace. Klein briefly told Rojan about some interesting things he encountered during the divination, then ended the topic, waved goodbye and walked towards the partition inside the captain's office. Dong dong dong, he knocked lightly on the open door, attracting the attention of Dun, who was tossing coffee. Dun looked up at him, quickly put down the coffee in his hand, and corrected his posture. Please come in. Klein has used his personal experience in the past few days. He has confirmed that the captain is trying to act as a method, and the other party has not reported it to the top of the church. Obviously, he has some scruples. He closed the door casually, and said with a little excitement in his solemn expression, Captain, I have completely digested the diviner potion. I want to submit a special application. Dun was not as surprised as Klein had imagined. He just looked at him like that quietly, his eyes were blank. After waiting for a long time, he took a breath, leaned back on the back of the chair, and said slowly, at that time, Dai Li also found me in the same way and said that she would submit an application. Oh, to be honest, I wasn't too surprised this time. You have given me too much foreshadowing and hints in advance. Dun looked at Klein calmly, but the expression on his face showed some vicissitudes that could not be concealed. His vision was blurred, as if he was looking for traces of the past. I won't stop you, but out of the captain's responsibility, I still have to make sure. Klein, are you sure you want to submit a special application? Dun's eyes regained focus and asked solemnly. Looking at the captain's reaction in front of him, Klein deliberately put away the joy that came from his heart, but his tone was still a little uncontrollable, rising slightly, I'm sure, Captain, I have already felt the feeling of the potion being completely digested, and I can be sure that I have the conditions for promotion. Dun, who was originally silent and quietly watched Klein, suddenly asked in a low voice, is this the result of what you call digestion? Seeing that the captain took the initiative to ask a question, Klein immediately replied, yes, when the potion was completely digested, I felt like something shattered in my mind. From then on, I can be sure that I have completely mastered the potion. It feels like something is broken. Dun chewed this sentence in a low voice, frowning slowly. Seeing that the captain was lost in thought, Klein did not disturb the other party, but stood quietly in the same place, allowing the other party to think. Perhaps the captain is not just thinking about the feeling of digestion. It is very likely that he was promoted without complete digestion in the first few promotions. There is no acting method to guide him, and he only relies on self-adaptation, which also limits the big picture. Difficulties for some beyonders. Captain, now, he should be thinking more about the opportunities he missed. After nearly a minute, Dun left the back of the chair and straightened his body. Klein's figure was reflected in his dark grey eyes again, and he spoke slowly, if it was before, I might persuade you to wait another year. After all, your background is special and you have such a speed of digestion. It would be too outstanding to submit a special application directly. But now, Dun let out a sigh of relief. Just now he also used the word digestion unconsciously. I think it may not be a bad thing to be noticed by the church. I will do it for you. Write a brochure to prove that you are in good shape, and maybe you can get further hope like daily. Suddenly, he was no longer as serious as usual, and the corners of his mouth twitched. Young people, you should seize the opportunity, you can write a special application. Okay. Klein also returned a slightly playful smile. He took 2 steps back softly, turned around and prepared to go out. Not surprisingly, when he just touched the doorknob, he heard a familiar addition. Wait a minute. Dun stopped the young man who was about to go out, looked at the joy on his face, and said carefully, you are not the only young man here. Also, Pay attention to the words you use when writing. The captain wants me to share the acting method? Klein was a little stunned for a while, and then nodded with a smile. He had planned to reveal some privately. Klein was sitting in the office of the civilian staff, in front of an Ackerson 1346 typewriter, thinking about his words while typing on the typewriter. Suddenly, he noticed that there was a shadow in front of him, blocking the sunlight, so he quickly looked up and found that it was Leonard Mitchell with messy long hair and the top two buttons of his shirt were casually open. He leaned against the door frame of the office, with his hands in his pockets, his messy long hair hung down, covering his green left eye, giving him an uninhibited beauty. Klein ignored the gaze of the other party, and quickly lowered his head, preparing to complete the end of the special application. After typing the last character and punctuation, he got up and asked, "What are you doing here?" Leonard smiled, and his green eyes looked at Klein with interest. "I just saw you writing something when I was passing by. You are not responsible for submitting the report today. I want to know what you are doing." Gay was gay. Klein quickly browsed through the application he had written. After confirming that it was correct, he explained casually, "Write a special application for promotion sequence 8. Leonard's originally lazy and unruly posture could not be maintained at once. He coughed violently. He couldn't help but prop up the door frame with his right hand. It took a long time for Leonard to return to normal. He hurriedly asked, "Have you finished digesting the diviner potion?" "Digestion? Poet classmate, let's reveal the secret in a hurry." Klein picked up the special application, missed Leonard, walked out of the office, then stopped outside the door, turned to look at Leonard, eyebrows raised, said jokingly, "Right. Also, I remember someone once told me that there are always some special people in this world who can accomplish things that others can't do. Like me. Like you, too." Leonard was stunned to the spot, his words were gagged in his mouth, his face flushed red, he adjusted his posture awkwardly, and put his arms around his chest. He opened his mouth, swallowed the invisible blockage in his throat, finally organized the language, and asked in a deep voice, "Don't you think this is too risky?" Since he understands the meaning of digestion, he should understand that there is no risk factor for my promotion. He is watching out for the top of the church? Klein thought for a while, and went back with a question, "Don't you think we have encountered too many coincidences recently?" Coincide? Leonard recalled the recent encounter, nodded thoughtfully, and muttered to himself, "Maybe, I should try it too." Seeing that he was lost in thought, Klein turned around and prepared to submit a report to the captain. He just took 2 steps when he felt his right hand sink suddenly. Turning to look, he found Leonard holding his hand with a big smile. He said with a smile, "As a special person, you should help others, right? Aren't all the protagonists of Emperor Roselle's novels like this? Aren't you going to share your experience with us? You know, sharing and reminding now may save us a teammate who is out of control in the future. This is too high for me to come down, and I originally planned to share it, but I just didn't want Tingen to have multiple special applications appear in a row." Klein helplessly shook his head and smiled, "I'm happy to share." Then now. Leonard's eyes suddenly lit up, and he couldn't wait to pull Klein to the Night Watcher's recreation room. He pushed open the half-closed door with force, let go of Klein's arm, opened his arms, and recited like a real poet, "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to solemnly introduce to you that the gentleman next to me has completely mastered the potion in just 1.5 months, and is about to hit Mr. Klein Moretti of Sequence 8. I'm about to die of embarrassment." This blunt exaggeration. Klein can't wait to escape from here and hide in the cracks in the ground. Leonard, you don't need to pull Klein to do such a blunt performance. He's about to smash his head. Senior writer Miss Sikatian smiled helplessly, ignoring what the other party said just now. Kernley glanced at the cards played on the table, and slowly folded his hand. "Leonard, stop joking." Fry took the card, glanced at Klein carefully, and said silently for a few seconds, are you sure you have mastered the potion? Yes, I've finished digesting it. Klein felt the other party's concern and nodded affirmatively. I feel a clear sign. Boom. Kernley stood up abruptly, brought down the stool beside him, and asked loudly, What? Really? Leonard shook the paper in Klein's hand with his fingers, and said mysteriously, Hey, this is the special application he just wrote, the special application for promotion to Sequence 8. Sikatian, who was usually the most quiet and elegant, could not control her emotions at this time. She took a deep breath and relieved the dryness of her throat, and asked the question she cared about most, how did this happen? Klein looked around for a week, looking at the familiar lounge and his teammates full of expectations. He pulled a chair and sat down slowly. Klein knocked on the door of Dunn's office again, walked in directly, signed his name at the end of the application document, and pressed his handprint. He finally swept aside the special application, held it in both hands, and handed it to Dunn. Dunn took a careful look, put down the application in his hand, and said, I'll attach a separate note. You should also be prepared to be reviewed by the sanctuary. Maybe it won't be too slow, maybe next week. Okay. Klein nodded solemnly, slowly exited the captain's office, and concealed the door. He walked quickly on the spiral staircase, and for some reason there was a kind of panic in his heart. He remembered the gossip that Rojan talked about the first time he walked through the ladder, and the joy when he became an Beyonder. Klein shook his head violently, throwing these distracting thoughts out of his mind. I'm just about to be promoted, why does it seem like I'm saying goodbye to my previous life? As he whispered to himself, he knocked on the guard's open door. He stood at the door and watched Luo Yao Lading, who had already packed his personal belongings, get up and walk towards the door. Klein nodded in greeting, and then said abruptly, I just discussed with Fry and the others about the digestion of potions, you can go to them to share. Luo Yao, who has slender eyebrows and hair that is as black and silky as silk, moved his lips a few times, but still said in a low voice, it is good. Klein looked at the surprised look of the other party and smiled. He was very much looking forward to the other party's reaction for a while. Unfortunately, I couldn't see it with my own eyes. Klein skillfully picked up Dunn's silver inlaid tin can and made himself a cup of fragrant Filmer coffee. He looked at the untreated and peculiar patterns on the coffee, felt the temperature that accompanied the overflow of the water mist, and thought about the taste he was about to taste. Boom! Klein was startled by the sound, almost spilled coffee on him, and couldn't help but look up. He saw old Neil dressed in a black robe and holding a felt hat of the same color at the door, gasping for breath, staring straight at him.